So we're talking about what processes we put in place in organizations that allow this agility to stay in place. There's also, if you've done any of this Agile work at all, you find out that when we first get started, and even long after it, you're probably in conflict with a lot of different parts of the organization. And so there's some feedback or some themes you'll get in the organization is just trust the teams. Give them everything they need to perform, and then just trust the teams to get it delivered. Right? That's really, really bad advice, because the teams don't own the responsibilities for the risks around finance and technology and brand and our audit and compliance things. There's a lot of valid concerns in the organization that actually need to constrain the way that teams operate. So what happens is we form these product aligned teams. We've got them working pretty well, but they're in conflict with a lot of parts of the organization. Those parts of the organization, like audit and finance and budget and some of the things we're going to talk about, are there to protect some other interests, some other organizational concerns. The conflicts that we start to run into, the things we start to bump into are the other parts of the organization that need to operate. And so what we need to begin to do is we need to understand those organizational concerns. I need to have my data center not deploy stuff that's going to take my network down or expose PII or cause my client's access to my stuff to fail. It just has to be true. But that can run into conflict with what we're trying to do from an Agile standpoint. So we're trying to deploy software more frequently. Well, like, you can't, because you can't get into my data center. So we need to understand why it's critical, and then walk the ladder of inference. So by ladder of inference, I mean people have reached a conclusion that we need to do giant big batch deploys with thousands of hours of testing and lots of energy wrapped around making sure nothing bad goes into the data center, because that's the way that they know how to not get risk. It turns out that giant batches, lots of work, all that integrates at the same time, is actually much riskier than smaller stuff. So we need to walk back from what they believe, because the concern that my data center can't go down is absolutely, completely valid. You guys agree with that? And we can't walk in and tell them, just trust us and get out of our way and let us, or we could go build our own private data center like one of my former CIO clients did. He's sitting back there somewhere. But the construct is, how do we go about having these conversations? What I'm trying to do is frame up, through this conversation around this wheel, a way to start to articulate those conversations and to get really clear and think about them in a meaningful way. So when we look at that, why do these things get in the way of operating fast? Why do these things get in the way of smaller batches? Because really, what is agility about? Agility is not about not planning up front, right? What is agility about? Agility is being able to deliver frequently and change direction if you need to. So we can do great big upfront plans. They may not be right, but what stops us from operating in smaller batches? What stops us from being able to understand the ability to move while protecting the concerns around the circle? So this framing of the conversation I'm going to have walks around these 8 areas and talks about how everything has to be aligned with your market and customers. Our job is to make more money now and in the future. It's to compete in the market, to protect our brand. It's to grow our resilience and our stability in the marketplace, right? Our goal isn't to be agile, but our goal also isn't to never to avoid all risk. Like, one of the really interesting things that I have a client up in New York City I was at last week, and one of the things they've gotten to with some of their measures was the only reasonable thing they could come up with is to never deploy any software ever, because everything was so fragile, it would break stuff. But you can't never deploy any software ever, right? So we had to have different conversations about how to get past that. But the way they were measuring people and what they were holding people accountable for was, you can't take down the subway system in New York, right? You're just not supposed to do that. And if you do that a couple of times, it becomes a big problem. So how do you get past the obstacles to be able to get there? I'm a little hoarse from yesterday too. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to walk this circle, and I'd be super interested if you have some thoughts or comments to share as we're going through this. But when we look at like our delivery organizations, and we're trying to put these product teams, these delivery teams, these portfolio teams in place, The concern that most organizations are working with around their resource and around their planning is, are people working hard enough? Are we getting the optimal amount of work through our organization? So what that looks like in a lot of organizations, we've gone in and there's like a list of all the projects in the organization this way and all the people in the organization this way, and everybody's allocated across 15 or 20 things. You guys familiar with that sort of spreadsheet? Right? So what about for the individual that's working on one of those teams? How effective are they? They're getting killed, right? Because they're being pulled in a million directions. And it turns out this stuff isn't linear and perfectly plannable. So one of the things that we've gotten really good at understanding is that we got to form some agile teams. We've got to get people together that know how to operate. But that's in conflict with somebody's job in the organization, which is to make sure that we're effectively utilizing our people. So we have to go sit down with the groups that are doing those big spreadsheets and have conversations about what does it really mean to produce an optimal amount of work through a team, because teams are the only way to maximize the throughput of the organization. We get more dollars out the door when we encapsulate the right things and orchestrate the longer time span things appropriately. We can get more work out the door. So we have to be able to tie the conversation to a bigger conversation, not just how busy are people, but how much work are we moving through? How much waste are we reducing and no longer producing because we're operating in teams and answering these things together? One of the things we're finding a lot of across the board, and it's happened with several of y'all, is how much stuff are we not building that we might have built because we didn't have the ability to connect anything, right? So being able to get super clear in this aligned organization where the delivery teams are aligned with our customers and markets allows us to produce more value. And it's not a moral thing about we want to do Scrum and we want to do things correctly. It is, we need to maximize how our resources are producing value. And everybody's, oh, you can't say resources, that's a bad word. No, man, it's money. I got to spend money, trying to do something in the market. It's an investment that we're making. We have to be able to have that conversation. And calling people resources isn't a bad thing. It isn't like we don't trust people or we don't love people or we're not good human beings. It's from an organizational standpoint, we're spending money to produce a result. And the optimal way to spend money to produce a result is to form well-formed teams that are relatively persistent, that stay aligned with the interest of the organization we're trying to accomplish, either our products or our capabilities or our value streams, and then find out what the maximum capacity is that team can produce, can consume, and maximize the throughput. Like if there's too few cars on the road, it's a problem. There's too many cars on the road. And these don't have to be these completely immutable, never changing size teams, because demand moves around the organization, because the pushback you'll get, because you'll have people say this is, if you form permanent teams that never change, but my demand doesn't look like that, then what am I gonna do when a big project comes in? Or what am I gonna do when I've got to outsource this? Well, we have to design these teams, the delivery organization, for resilience of shifting of capacity, core team members, cross-training some core team members across teams, building frameworks that allow us to scale work up and down as demand ebbs and flows. Maybe you don't outsource your most important capabilities 100% to a vendor that then you have no control over, and when the contract's over, nobody's running your product anymore. Like there's probably some things that we can do around how we design the teams to optimize the throughput today and in the future for that work. Do y'all have any experience? I'm gonna try so I can get somebody to talk here. Do y'all have any experience with trying to form stable teams or persistent teams in your organization and you ran into challenges doing it? Is anybody bumping up against that? Carolyn, did you ever bump up against that? So how did you get past it? You just went and told me you were going to do it anyway, right?
So we stacked the deck with the pilot. The pilot was a raging success, and so as a result, it was totally encapsulated. It was new technology. Once the rest of the organization saw what we could do, people lined up. So it was being able to show the results really, really fast, helped us sell it across the rest of the org.
So it's interesting because you got the product development organization aligned, you made it work, but the real movement in the organization was having all these other conversations with how we staff and how we do resource planning and how we deal with capacity challenges. And I think there's some really good patterns that are knowable out there about how to make all that work. I don't know that we have, they're not generally in the literature. They're like secrets that we know. We need to make these things be more common and more frequently applied across the board, right? Because this is not a number of Scrum teams problem. This is how do I measure a manager's success based on the size of his team when I'm going to have more people and less people from time to time based on the problem that we're solving. So this idea up here, which is what's the mismatch? Project-oriented efforts kill us. There's a number of reasons why project-oriented efforts kill us. One of the problems is when we maximize utilization through projects, and then we prioritize projects. Which projects get to the top of the stack? The biggest ones. And what do we do to make them bigger or big enough to make it to the top? We start adding a lot more stuff into it to make it even bigger and bigger. And then they're too big to fit in. So we're working on 15 things at the same time. They're all actually much bigger than they need to be to solve the problems we need to solve in the market. And we're making this really chaotic environment. And that's how our organizations operate. Like most of us operate with some aspects like that. And so what are the impacts of that brokenness? We're trying to optimize people's utilization. We're trying to put the biggest projects at the top. What could be wrong with that? But the problem is our architecture start to degrade because your architecture follows the design of your organization, the communication paths. So when you have a chaotic set of communication paths, what does your architecture start to look like over time? Really muddled and messy, right? Hard to maintain and hard to change. You've got people that are emotionally exhausted because they're working on 1,000 things at once. You end up with huge trust issues between the organization that's building the software and the people consuming the software because you're late all the time, or things break, or costs start to go up. Right? So these are all we can point to these in the design of the delivery organization and talk about all the problems that come from the project-oriented efforts. And then we can talk about it being inside out versus outside in. One of the biggest challenges we see, we dealt with this recently with another client out in the Midwest, where there are people on the ground who are trying to keep their teams together, so they're coming up with projects to keep their people busy, because they've got 37 people, so they need to find 37 people's worth of work. And so you end up with these inflexible inflexible capacity with these teams that are in place with no ability to adapt, and you can't deliver anything faster, and you're performing more and more poorly over time. Like that's the result of project-based work through the organization. Does anybody experience that? Can you see that? So we can build financial models and go to the utilization, because the right thing to do is to design the organization from the outside in. It's to look at, instead of inside out, instead of trying to keep my people busy, instead of trying to keep my team busy, instead of trying to keep everybody utilized, I need to go understand what are the most important things I'm going to solve in the market. What teams do I need to build to deliver on that? How much capacity do they need in the next 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year to move towards that capacity? And how do I now operate within that? And then what types of things do I need to do as I design my teams, my delivery organization, to create resilience while allowing for scale up and down? Like that, those are the designs that we have to start talking about around the delivery side. So it's outside in. We're only spending money that we need to spend to solve a problem. We're building stable teams, and what we will get is better, the type of throughput that they were talking about in the Lockheed Martin thing. Like that's real. We see that again and again. What we got at Auto Trader. Right? I mean, it just works. And we have enough information to build good data around it. So the delivery system itself, if you design it right, it works better. And now think about this. If you design it right and you're predictable and work is flowing and you can start to get smaller pieces of work going through it, what does that do to the other parts of the organization? Does that increase the burden or decrease the burden on all the rest of the parts of the organization? Is it more stressful when you're out of control and you're showing up with stuff that's broken and your architectures are crap? Can I say that on, is that an FCC bad word? And your architectures are eroding, right? It puts a ton of stress on the rest of the organization. So what we want to talk about is outside in, design of the organization, intentional design, outside in, demand planning to solve specific problems, and intentionally beginning to remove the dependencies that make work move slowly through our organization. Good with that? So the next thing that we'll talk about here on the wheel is where do the backlogs come from? So I got the people that are building work, but where do the backlogs come from? Where's the work coming from for an organization? What we find as we start to bump into is most product management organizations in big companies fall into one of two buckets. Not all of them, but most of them in large companies fall into one of two buckets. They're either order taking, they're like sales driven, order taking, whatever the customer wants, we'll build, without really having any idea which things are actually going to move the needle. They're just trying to build software because the customer wants it built and they will come. We actually had a client up in, and some of the people are here from that. We had a client up in Philadelphia who had a lot of pressure on them to add all these new features. They'd gone to this client and said, what will it take to keep you? And they just kept adding features and they didn't even want them. They just sort of arbitrarily doing it. And one day, the product manager of the group just goes, we can't do it. I don't have no more capacity. I can't spend any more money. The guy goes, well, I was just gonna ask until you told me to quit. Like, we were actually kind of happy with what we had to start with. They're about 6 months down the road. There was like one outage and one feature that they actually needed to stay engaged with the customer. Right? So we get in the habit of order taking. I think our product managers and the conflict that we have historically is because our systems were out of control and the only way to get anything through is to start shoving things in and dictating, and everything has to be giant to get to the top of the stack. We haven't created an opportunity for product management to ask questions with. So they don't know how to operate in smaller batches, focus on customer problems, really aligned with delegating intent into the system. That came up in a couple of different conversations as well today. Delegating intent, here's the problem I'm solving in order to accomplish this goal in the market. So we end up with having to go reteach product management how to operate because they're entrenched in a way of doing things that relied on a system that we want to go away. So there's a lot of work to do around aligning with product management. Today, you're going to be operating in conflict with them. There's another really insidious thing around product management, which is a big blocker. There's no such thing as a product owner. How many of y'all have a product owner in your org chart? Like have a job, a career path? Job and a career path for a product owner? What do they promote into?
I was a business analyst.
Okay.
Because I had that relationship with the business, so it was a easy fit. But yes, that is a career path that we have in my organization.
Most organizations have a pretty clear career path for like a developer. You start as a developer 1, you become a developer 2, you become a developer 3, you eventually become a manager, you become an architect, you might move in a specialized direction. We have this critical role in the Agile community around product management. There's not a job career path well-defined in the organization for where does a product owner go. Anybody else have that challenge? So what do we do about that, right? So we have to start really thinking about, because the person who's a business analyst today, that's now being asked to move out of their business analyst 3 role where they've got some seniority and they're a couple years from getting their pension or whatever, and we're gonna ask them to go become a product owner, and there's no career path, there's no history, there's no future for it. Like, that's a pretty significant problem. So I think we really have to start building out super clarity on either using the roles that exist in the organization, but we don't really want to because they mean things that aren't exactly what we want, or building a healthy ecosystem around these jobs, because this isn't like a small garage team. These are big enterprises, and my career matters to me, right? So there's a problem with we don't know where to go. There's an interesting problem that a lot of product owners came in from the project management side of the world. So they're really sort of command by directive. Build the plan, go tell people what to do, micromanage every task, and they're really pushing work. And they're not building the types of ecosystems that we want, the type of organizational constraints that we want, where we're learning and delegating and expanding our capability. So we're putting the wrong people in those jobs because we're not telling them how to be successful at their job. We're taking project managers and putting them into a job that doesn't have a defined career path. And then we're holding them accountable for getting product out the door the way we always have, and then we're not getting the results that we want, this dynamic learning, this rapid adapting, teams that are operating healthy, become predictable, that we can empower over time. So the two paths are, we're either order taking as product managers, nobody's actually forming an opinion, it's not connected to something meaningful, a problem we're solving, or we're directive and order taking. So what we really want to move towards in the product management area is going from command by directive to command by intent. That means we want to actually, we talk about this, we want to deeply understand our customer and the markets we're going after. We want to be able to validate and justify our value propositions that we're closing. Why are we trying to solve this problem for this customer in this market relative to the other 100 problems we could solve for other customers in other markets? Like, why are these at the top of the stack? And where do we start to draw the line? But now that my organization is kind of aligned around products, and we've got teams that can deliver, we can actually start to prioritize those value propositions on a quarterly or 6-month or 9-month basis. And that's a lot better conversation than projects, because projects, you can be solving a problem and you can make up a dollar amount for it, but we're actually trying to win in the market. So connecting our product management to the market and then connecting those value propositions to our delivery teams creates a whole different way of going after communicating value than what we had before. Does that resonate? What do you think, Aaron? I see you thinking. Actually, like one of the groups that you worked with was pretty healthily moving in this direction, right? So that's interesting, but not everywhere. And most organizations have a bigger problem with this order taking. I think that might be something that you still experience a little bit of.
There's so many dynamics there, and what we've gone through in our journey, from an order-taking organization to one that is more customer-oriented and I don't even know where to start.
Well, we aligned with customers, started trying to do value propositions and OKRs, which I'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah.
Right? Started trying to talk about how to actually articulate strategy, and then trying to do the smallest things necessary to close the gap and holding them accountable for closing the gap. Like you're like ahead of most people in the world in what's going on there. And you've done a great job leading that. But we did have the product owner problem. We didn't have career paths. We had like a lot of the career pathing problems. And there's management problems as well, because who like runs that group now? Who do I report to? So there's all kinds of like organizational structure problems around the product side as we start to shift into this model.
And that's, we are looking at, from the product management perspective, product owners ultimately becoming product managers ultimately moving into more leadership roles in the organization. Yep. So when we developed that whole structure at Financial, that was our thought process of how we selected those individuals that were going into those product owner roles. Are they capable of taking on higher levels of responsibility in the organization? The other piece that we were looking at is we were very selective when we put that org together, both product owners and product managers, picking the key talent across the organization, because it sent a signal to the broader group that this is where you want to be to propel your career for the future. So Those were some things that we were thinking about as we built this structure a couple of years ago.
So a lot of people don't have an avenue towards solving that. These guys do. So you should give them over coffee, over lunch. They're starting to make some good progress in that area. The thing that's really interesting to me about this is changing that product management model doesn't work if you don't have stable teams that actually deliver something. I think there's like an order to solving these problems that matters. We got to get the teams working first, and then we can start exploiting them with better outside-in thinking. We have to get some fungibility in our capacity, some ability to move, expand, and reduce capacity as demand changes. We have to create some muscle and some discipline in prioritizing value propositions that's capacity aware and dependency aware and capacity constrained. There's some muscles that have to be developed in this area for this to work well. But in the meantime, when you first spin up your product owners, you're in total conflict with everything around the organization. And then we put the wrong people in those jobs a lot of times. So it's interesting. As we start to walk around the wheel, the next thing that we're looking at is strategy articulation. I think, again, this is kind of like an evolution. As we elevate, we bump into the next big constraint. And strategy articulation in most organizations, it's sort of platitudes and slogans, right? And it could be, we want to be the number one here. We want to be the best here. We want to grow dramatically in this market. The problem is it's really, really difficult to turn those platitudes and slogans, and I don't mean that negatively, because it's good intention, and it was well drawn up, like they're the right things. But if we can't, strategy is not who do I want to become? Strategy is how am I going to apply my limited resources and capacity to achieve an outcome. Strategy constrains a set of decisions around limited capacity. So we end up with strategies that aren't well articulated. Some of that, I think, is because we didn't actually have the ability to go execute really, really tightly on strategies in the past in a lot of cases, particularly around our product development organizations. And so what we're looking at is how do I begin to articulate strategy in an actionable way? So I've got some OKRs, objectives and key results. I'm tying those to some value propositions, areas where we want to go win at. We've got some sort of an understanding of the capabilities, the business architecture that we use to design the organization on the front end, that we then looked at through the eyes of the customer to identify the actual gaps that we want to close, then become a piece that we can use to say, we're going to make these investments towards these value propositions to close these gaps in our capabilities, and they drive those OKRs in a very mature and actionable sort of frame. I don't think that's discipline that we have in a lot of organizations, and I think there's an interesting gap when we ask for organizations to go do OKRs. We get a lot of pushback. We don't want to work that hard. I don't want to make it measurable. I don't want to be held accountable for something, and I don't know what's actually possible. So the OKR problem is an interesting problem, but most organizations, we don't have super actionable strategies. Does anybody disagree with that? Does anybody agree with it? Is anybody actually going to raise their hand? Yeah, so I think it's very interesting when we're talking about getting better at executing strategies, and we don't know how to articulate strategies in an actionable frame. Like, it's just not a muscle that we have. But if our job is to build organizations that can better respond to changing strategies in the future, then we have to get really good at articulating them in an actionable way. So value propositions, capability models, OKRs have proven to be relatively resilient. And they're also things that people can wrap their heads around. And we're not having any conversations around technology or machine, like we're not having like these crazy, meaningless conversations. We're having business conversations. What's really cool about this, if you're an IT executive, is I think these conversations around value propositions and capabilities and KPIs bring you to the table as a partner having business discussions. You can start leading some business discussions or participating. And one of the things we hear all the time is IT executives want to be part of the strategy conversation. IT executives want to have a seat at the table, but they don't, because they walk in and start talking about how they're I can't think of anything, they don't have sufficient disk space on their servers, and they can't get in the cloud, and that network thing that we did last week, that upgrade didn't go very well because we didn't have the right CPU software thing installed, like something ridiculous, right? That just isn't even interesting. But how about if we're going, hey, here's the thing, man. You want to go capture those customers? You want to solve that problem for those customers in that market? We have these 6 capabilities that impacts. These 6 capabilities, these 3 are inflexible because we haven't made the right investments in making them be flexible. Let me tell you what I'm going to have to do to solve that for you. It's like a business conversation. And we're not making promises we can't keep, too, because that's the other thing. Melissa talked about coming out, or Anita talked about coming out with strategies that aren't tied to what we're actually competent to do. So these things tie together. It's a really tight ecosystem. It's super powerful to have actionable conversations around strategy. But if we can't do that, we're not going to become the types of companies that can. And here's the problem. We historically have not been super effective at changing the way organizations want to go do their executive board level strategic planning, right? Because it's so disconnected. But if everything is technology driven, what we're operating in conflict with today is the way that organizations articulate and plan their strategies. We do a 3-year strategy, we do a 1-year strategy, we bind it, we send it out, we have a big kickoff, we put it on the shelf, everybody goes and does whatever they were doing in the first place, right? So we got to come up with a better way to articulate it. We will fail to deliver the promise of agility to our organizations if we don't get better at how we connect our strategy to what we're actually going to do to achieve it. And if we don't start using effective models for articulating strategy, we're going to continue to work on things that aren't the most important stuff. The willpower that it takes for Lockheed Martin to go in and cut 67% of the stuff out of a backlog. Client in New York City, he just erased his entire backlog for 6 agencies and said, start your request over because nothing in here is worth doing. It's crazy. It takes a lot of will to do that. And it's not going to get done unless we're connecting it to like a really important strategic ability to improve our ability to perform. So I think this is something we're in conflict with that we have to operate within. I think there's a lot of work here. We actually have been building a really strong team around product and strategy in this next piece, because I think that is like the next class of problems in big enterprises, is how do we change that space? So I see this coming. The budgeting and funding thing is interesting to me because there's a lot of literature out there. Who's heard of projects to products? Anybody had that conversation? Projects to products is becoming big. There's a lot of talk about forming teams around capabilities or value streams. There's a lot of discussion around that. And it is in fact, a budgeting exercise. It's a financial planning exercise. But in most organizations today, even companies that have gone through, we did a projects to products. We're a product-based company now, cool. So you have a budget that has your keep the lights on, your modernization, your new features. You got a person that's responsible for making decisions to make those changes. 90% of the time, oh no, I just have the project budget. What we really did is we just put all the projects into one budget and give it to one guy to go run. But he has no incentive to make it less expensive to maintain it over time. We're still ending up with organizations that can't get stuff through their IT organization going and buying something on the side to solve a problem and then throwing it into a data center that was never budgeted to support it and increasing the complexity of the organization. That's a major, major problem in how we allocate money. It shouldn't be possible for that person to go buy that. But here's what's fascinating. If you haven't solved the other problems around the wheel to make an organization that can be trusted to do the most important things and a way to have a conversation about why there's no value and variation of that capability, like strategically, it doesn't make sense for you to go buy your own thing because this one's good enough for you, right? If we can't have those conversations, we can't solve this budgeting and funding problem. So most of the projects to products, budgeting type exercises that I've walked into have not been successful. Even though they might want to do it because we haven't solved these other classes of problems that lead up to it. Make sense? So not just my product delivery is aligned with my markets and customers and everything is aligned with my markets and customers, but they're also building each other. That stack of skills, the muscles we have to build to be good at have to kind of be addressed. But so we have to work that out. The project-led funding that we used to do led to local optimizations because it's like a vicious circle now, right? The project-based funding led to messed up architectures, people are stressed out, a lack of trust and confidence in the world. So again, I don't think you can start. I think you have to go back and start with what Mike talked about, safety, base camp 1, the trustworthy system. We have to kind of go start earning our trust and earn our way back around the circle. We actually kind of know how to do this budgeting. And we kind of know how to get to total cost of ownership for the capabilities that we offer. It's just organizationally, we can't get there because we can't support the product and make all the other decisions to get there, right? So I think there's a class of problems that's very interesting there we have to solve for. And it is interesting to me that I think Agile did this sometimes. We're going to get into DevOps in a second. I think DevOps got there. You see these movements, they get into big enterprises because they make sense. And then they bounce off of the enterprise because that won't work here. Well, you're right, it won't work there because the conditions don't exist. So just like until we could form stable teams, keep them together, we couldn't get the Agile stuff working. Like we're now bumping into great ideas that won't work because the conditions don't exist. So we have to walk our way through the wheel, sort of figure it out. The technology and architecture one is really interesting to me. This is dev, sec, ops, security, resilience, reliability. These things are so critical today. But imagine that you are running a data center. You're an I&O executive, and you're responsible for a data center and deploying software in. You've got fragile architectures that have eroded over time because of how we've been funding and running things. You've got project-based groups that all show up at the last minute, untested, unreliable, with no flow and no planning. You're not involved until the week before you're supposed to put it in the data center. Like, this is an impossible problem to solve today. Our technologies and architectures, DevOps doesn't solve this problem. And so you have to be able to deploy software rapidly to be able to respond to the market rapidly. We have to be able to get things in safely and securely and reliably. Those are really valid concerns, like critically important concerns, but we're not sitting down with the infrastructure and operations people, with our architects. How many of y'all have an enterprise architect or an architect first-class partner in planning of all the initiatives that come into IT? Do you have like high-level standards, ivory tower sort of architecture? Or do you have somebody looking and helping you drive these decisions with each initiative? You got them in there? Cool. So that's good. Like a lot of organizations don't, or a lot a lot of organizations end up with what I'll call, I'm going to say ivory tower. It's not, but they write standards. There might be an architecture review board, but they're not first team members of these delivery organizations. How have you guys solved that?
So I've got architecture embedded with the teams where product and architecture are kind of a partnership. And they're thinking about standards and processes and enablers together in the context of what the customer or the value delivery is.
Do they have financial responsibility for the performance of the thing after they've shipped it, either from a market standpoint or from a cost of data center?
From an architecture perspective?
Does that team, that architect and product person are on together?
Yeah, so as you were talking through as you're walking through the wheel, and I'm kind of going through this now, right? I almost feel like there's multiple dimensions to the wheel because you can't put, and this can't be a synchronous process. You have to have each of these, and kind of, as I'm, just came into the organization and kind of making this shift from project into product, right?
Yep.
I'm thinking about product areas that have a P&L, and trying to shift away from these funded areas that are project-based, and even ties back into what you were saying around the career path for the product owner, right? From and coming out of CVS Health and now kind of in a growth stage health genomic company, focused on the product owner into product management, and then depending on the size and scope of a product area, that may have multiple product managers that kind of lead into a product executive, if you will.
Yep.
And that product executive for that area, where I'm trying to shift to, has a P&L that will factor in how many teams, what revenue mix, what investment mix, and the technology base.
And does he have responsibility for the data centers and the hosting and the maintenance and support and the bug fixes as well? Like financially, does he own the whole thing, or is he just coming up with new ideas and pushing them in there? Because that to me that's a hard thing to get to in most organizations, because that's an interest that wants to be protected by the data center group. And so what happens is we create a condition where the people that need to be participating in the design of it actually don't want to participate, and we don't make them be financially responsible for being part of the conversation. So I think it's an interesting gap.
Well, I get to own it, but we're completely cloud based.
Okay.
So we can tag through that, and it can get to driving those costs and having that be part of the conversation. But I'm just on the beginning parts of this journey.
Yeah.
So
what's cool about the model, first off, is I don't think there's anything, I think it's right. It certainly isn't linear, right? Nothing is linear. It's really messy. You're going to go around it 100 times and all the time. But I think having the ability to have the different concerns up there and talk to them and very intentionally go, why is that person being awful to me and getting in the way of me solving this problem? Like, why is my infrastructure operations executive not helping me? Why is my architect not working with me to help me solve these problems? And it's because they're trying to protect something important. So this just gives us the ability to go have that conversation. And you're right, it's all noodled together. But I like the frame, and I think this is the first time we've really done a big public rollout of the wheel like this to sort of talk about it. So I'm happy that it seems to be kind of resilient to everybody's experience as well. Cool. So we have to shift to product and technology encapsulation, leveraging modern practices. Like if our infrastructure operations can't get there, we're not going to be able to deploy reliably and securely and scalably into the environment. So your cloud move is super cool. That's the right that's why that works. But I think all these other issues, if I can't show up with something shippable frequently, like the DevOps cloud thing isn't a solution. So I got to be able to orchestrate all the work around the wheel. The compliance and controls, in this case, it's really interesting. Again, this sort of follows, but how many of y'all have audit requirements or financial control responsibilities, or you're measuring for regulatory or compliance rules? Like there's a lot of things that tend to control or constrain our product development efforts. And I think those were designed to protect us from real risks and real concerns when the system was out of control and broken. What we have found over time, and I think in some places, this is sort of a solved problem in some regards, but I think what we found over time is that this new model, when it's working well, is easier to audit, more reliable, more responsible. It's cleaner if you can get the discipline in place. Where this breaks down for me is when organizations want to come in and think Agile means you'll get what you get when you get it, and I'm going to work however I want to, and you just got to trust the team. Like, again, that's just the wrong advice, right? No, here's how you have to operate. Here's what it's going to look like. Like, I'm paying you, right? I have to run the organization responsibly. You're going to operate within these constraints. You're going to be able to self-organize within that. We're going to be able to delegate decision-making into you over time, but we're sure as heck not going to jail or getting shut down or getting fined. So what we have to do is figure out how to take these real valid concerns of auditors and regulators and compliance people and figure out how to integrate them into our governance models and into our flow of work, and not as something that stands to the side or is outside of it. You just still need, there's an interesting thing, you still need independence of review of the results, but that doesn't mean they can't sit in the meeting, help you plan your design of your governance model so they get what they need when they need to. We actually did this exercise with y'all too. This was like actually laying out on the governance model some of the regulatory stuff. So that's a powerful tool. The audit compliance regulators won't change their world until we become relatively predictable. So it's just like you got to go do the first one, you got to prove it. You got to do the second one, you got to prove it. You're going to be actually operating in most cases in conflict, in direct conflict with auditable requirements around capitalization or some sort of security thing or one of these things, right? You're going to have to go all kinds of exceptions, but eventually we have to bring them in to the new model, or we're going to have to go back and operate the old way.
Our contract, I was a contractor with our CDC was our client. And when you have a contract to build something for the CDC, there are stage gates that you have to go through. So at the time that I was working with Northrop Grumman, we were trying to be agile, if you will, right? And not go through those project-based waterfall. Let's sit with the client and talk about this, and then give them something 6 months down the line or whatever, and then it's different than what they want. So we ran into, like I said, a lot of the roadblocks with the stage gates, because there's certain requirements that you have to, tangible requirements, documentation wise, that you had to meet. So we weren't able to do Agile. What we switched to at that time was prototyping. So yeah, so this is interesting. There's like two different angles on this. One of them is procurement's going to be the next big obstacle to most of y'all getting to Agile, because most of you probably aren't writing most of your code in-house. Most organizations are writing 67% of their code through contracts. And procurement is based on a set of regulatory guidelines, protection, all kinds of stuff. There's companies, many firms have outsourced their procurement to firms that have a set of rules that will actually get in the way of you being able to write contracts that can deliver incrementally, iteratively. So there's a whole, that's a complicated rat's nest around procurement. Again, it's one of those things that's going to take a lot of will and some trust to solve over time. That's a real problem. The second answer to that is, though, is you can, agility doesn't mean we didn't plan everything up front. Right.
Agility means that we delivered incrementally, iteratively, and got feedback as we're going. We drove risk down early. We're never deferring risk any later than we have to. Right? And so I can do a big fixed bid. As a matter of fact, we did some of this. My brother and I, back in the mid-90s, did some fixed bid software development projects. We had them plan and scope it and price it. And we did a fixed bid, fixed scope, fixed cost deal. And we delivered about a third the time they could possibly deliver it. So we made pretty good money off of it. I did a bunch of that work for Pro Systems back in the day too. So even though they designed it fixed bid and we had like a complete requirements document, first off, you have never done a project where what you delivered was actually what was in the requirements document.
True.
It's never happened. Right?
Agreed.
But what we do is we figure out late what options. Ron Liker. Hey, Ron. And Lyle. You remember Lyle? At Agris? Sitting with Ron and Lyle, and I walk up and I go, so here's the thing. We can't deliver this project the way that we defined it, the way you asked for it. It can't be done the way you wanted to. I have three options we can explore to get to the outcome that you want. And Lyle goes, I knew this Agile stuff wouldn't work here. We never have these types of problems on our main projects until we're 80 or 90% of the way done. I was like, okay. Actually, if you'll take a step back and look at this from a different lens, this might actually be a better place to be figuring out that your plan was stupid, right? He actually understood it, like right as it came out of his mouth, he was like, okay, let's back up on this one. Yeah. But but you've never delivered to the scope. So go ahead and produce the document, but then create the risk management stuff and hire somebody to write the freaking change orders, right? And get paid. So you can still use this approach. You can do everything else, but if procurement's in your way, you just got to play the game. But that doesn't mean that you need to go operate in a risk-laden way. And I think we fall into that. We sometimes have this conversation around doing what's in the SOW versus actually solving the problem we're solving. It's like, I go do this. I'm not interested in that conversation. This is the conversation I need to be having right now. Right? And so I think that we don't have to operate to the same phase gates that they put in front of us. Oh, here's a funny story. Naveed Ashraf was here last night. He was the CIO of a company called Security First Network Bank. And we were operating under compliance controls from Royal Bank of Canada, which had bought SFNB. And we were doing like a complete launch of a whole bank, an electronic digital, first internet bank, we'll say that. And I had to operate to their model, but we were doing it all Agile. I had product-based teams. I had a whiteboard in. We were pulling a feature a week. We were like building the whole thing totally in conflict with their organization, with their organizational guidelines. But I had 3 people whose job was to produce all the paperwork that the governance team needed to meet their requirements. So we did a big upfront design, and then we just managed the heck out of it. We didn't spend months and months and months refining it because we knew it was wrong. But we met the intent, we met the letter of the procurement guidelines, but we operated with the intent to drive risk down early and get what they wanted. And we actually delivered something that they had failed to do 2 times before, and about 2/3 of the time they'd been working on it. To the point, one day, this is kind of a funny story, but one day the director of their PMO came down and pulled all my stickies off the boards at the end of the things and erased all my boards. And because I had 3 people whose jobs were to produce the paperwork to support him, they were able to put the boards up the next day because I had all this stuff. If he had not forced me to do the paperwork, I couldn't have recovered from erasing all my boards. So that was kind of funny. He didn't think it was funny. He still does, and he doesn't talk to me anymore. What's really interesting to me is this talent and culture. We talked about it a little bit from a product management standpoint, but changing the way that we operate creates a lack of safety for a lot of people. Talent culture is interesting to me. Hiring the right people for the job that have the right sort of intrinsic skill sets and beliefs is important. Like there's actually things that you have to be able to be good at some of these jobs. What's really interesting, if you looked at the picture that Melissa put up about the base camps, probably 60 to 70% of your organization doesn't actually have to be on the right-hand side of that board at all. They don't have to be base camp 3, 4, or 5. 60% of your organization can just be base camp 1 or 2. And there are people that are perfectly wired to operate in a relatively stable, relatively static sort of maintenance. I'm not competing on change in these capabilities. So I think we have to be thoughtful about who can deal with ambiguity and operate with change and who needs to be really stable and steady. And that's something we have to pay attention to as we're staffing our organizations. There are managers that are better at that. You wouldn't want me managing your base camp 1 and 2 stuff, I'll tell you that, right? But I'll do your 4 and 5 stuff and you'd be happy with the result, right? So it's actually true in our organization. Chris is probably laughing at me. Chris is our guy that actually can run organizational projects. He's gonna be up here in a few minutes. So the talent and culture thing becomes very interesting because what we see in a lot of cases is we don't know the nature of the people that should be in the job. Sometimes we hire from resumes, or sometimes we put people in something they're interested in, right? You're also, I'm never gonna play second row in a rugby game. I was a pretty good rugby player for a long time. I never played second row because I'm not 6'4" and I don't weigh 300 pounds, right? But I was good at what I did, but I couldn't play that job. So you don't put people in a job they can't do even if they want to, because it looks like a fun job. You don't put people in that don't have the basic wiring and intrinsics. And so we have to be thoughtful about that. So I'm not gonna put somebody in charge of a base camp 4 or 5 team that will not change the way they're doing things because they're wired to always hold to the old rules, and they're not gonna participate in the continuous improvement game. I can go put them on a base camp 1 or base camp 2 thing, because as long as we don't break stuff down there, it's probably pretty good. Not perfect, That's a way better place for them. Our training in our organizations and our elevation stuff for people. Most of our training for these new roles, we're throwing a lot of new words out there. What is an orchestrator? What is a product owner? How are we operating this new model? You're going to expect my compliance. Where's Melissa? Somebody threw a book at me one day. You're going to make us change how we do QA now too? Like she threw a book at me and stormed out of the room. It's like, it's okay, we'll work this out. But yeah, we're gonna change how you're testing because you can't do all the testing on the back end and do this Agile stuff. Right, and I realize that you've been struggling with it for 10 years and just wrestled it to the ground. But the reason it was impossible is because you're operating in an irrational system. We're gonna solve it in a rational way and you're gonna be happy. She became very happy with it over time, but it was just a moment for her. But we didn't do a good job of explaining and training and elevating their QA people to create safety for them in the change that we're making. I think the change management and roles across the board is way more important in the career path, because if you go off the shelf and you go buy any Scrum thing, any safe training, any product training anywhere, they're not gonna teach you how to think and operate appropriately in this model, because this model is emerging, it's changing, it becomes a bigger game. So I think we have to be really thoughtful about how we manage talent and how we set people up for safety. And it actually matters. We have to also get managers to understand that career pathing thing has become such a big blocker in a few organizations. I've got one that has a bunch of union people in the development and in the data center. Like you can't sidestep those requirements when the union's there, right? So I think this talent thing becomes a really big area for us to pay attention to, and I do think that it's an obstacle and a blocker. We can go form our little special teams and build some websites, but we're talking about transforming organizations. We got to rethink how we're standing up talent and culture. And then the last one, and probably the most important one, is around leadership. And the one thing that we've been talking a lot about today is building a trustworthy system. We've been talking about designing an organization. We've been talking about creating alignment between concerns, organizational concerns, the organization. So what leadership becomes is people who are in leadership roles focusing on building the system that can operate the way that we need to. They're working on the system, not in the system. Now, they need to be aware of what's in the system, and sometimes we have to push and shove and kick things through the door. Right? Still has to happen. But if you had to push and shove and kick things through the door to make it work, we need to go figure out why we were there and start redesigning the system. I think this is true at all levels of leadership in the organization. This concept of moving towards a model of continuous improvement is about building leaders that understand that we got to build systems and training them to understand how systems work. What does it mean to be agile? What does it mean to be product focused? What does it mean to be financially responsible, making good business decisions? What does it mean to apply lean principles in these areas? What does it mean to actually empower people, right? What does it mean to create a system that I can trust to delegate into to empower people to do something they couldn't do before? All right, how do I get, like the Lockheed Martin gentleman talked, how do I get people performing way above their level? Like this new system elevates some people to perform better than they ever performed before. So this concept of how we elevate leadership and train leadership is important. Somebody made a joke about 20 years ago to me that we're gonna have to wait for the current generation of leaders to die off before we can actually start making this change. So it's now 20 years in, and I think that we've got leaders that understand where we're trying to go, how to get there. So we got to keep moving this forward. So achieving business agility is not a technology effort, right? It matters, and it's critical, and it must be done well, but it's not the anchor. All of the organizational concerns must be considered and adapted, right? None of the Scrum in the world is going to change and solve for any of the problems on that chart that we looked at before. Creating the organizational conditions to achieve capabilities while responsibly maintaining the ongoing organizational concerns is a first-class consideration of where we're going as we lead into business agility. So I have 7 seconds for a question. All right, thank you very much.